This is a fig. You've eaten one without a second thought. But 11,000 years ago, someone dried a handful of figs and stored them in a house in the ancient Jordan Valley. And those figs may be older than farming itself, older than the first city, older than the wheel. Picture that world. No cities, no kings, no writing. Human beings hunt and gather, the way their ancestors have for 100,000 years. This is the story we usually tell ourselves. A long wait in the dark, right up until someone plants the first seed and history finally begins. But in the ashes of that burned house, archaeologists found something that doesn't fit the story. Not weapons, not gold, figs. 9 small carbonized fruits, carefully dried and stored. And when scientists looked closely at what kind of figs these were, they found something strange. These figs appear to come from a variety that may have depended on humans to reproduce it. Someone, it seemed, may have been growing them deliberately. That single detail unsettles almost everything we assume about where we came from. What if the fruit came before the farmer? And this was only the beginning. Thousands of years later, dried figs would travel with soldiers, cross seas with merchants, appear in sacred texts, and even become part of Rome's struggle with its greatest rival. This is the story of the fig, a fruit sitting in supermarkets right now beside the pastries and the energy bars. And it may be one of the oldest plants human beings ever deliberately grew. Follow it far enough back, and the humble fig stops being a snack and becomes a witness to the moment our species stopped simply taking what nature offered and started reshaping the living world to serve us. Before farming, there were figs. To understand why a handful of ancient figs matters this much, you have to stand in the world before the fields. Roll back around 12,000 years. The last ice age is loosening its grip. The sheets of ice that locked up the northern world are retreating, and the climate is turning warmer and wetter. Rivers run fuller, grasslands spread, and in one arc of land, the Fertile Crescent, curving from the eastern Mediterranean through the Levant toward Mesopotamia, conditions are becoming almost generous. This is the cradle where so much of the human future will be decided. The people here aren't farmers, not yet. They're hunter-gatherers, but not aimless wanderers. They carry deep, inherited knowledge of the land, which plants would feed you and which would kill you when the wild grasses ripened, how to dry food and carry it through a lean season. They knew where the wild fig trees grew along the streambeds, and they came back to them year after year, generation after generation. And in some places they were beginning to settle, building the first permanent houses and staying put long enough for a village to form. This is the beginning of what archaeologists call the Neolithic transition, the slow shift from a world of movement to a world of settlement and eventually to farming. But nobody woke up one morning and invented agriculture. There was no flash of insight, no lone genius pressing a seed into the soil. People had been living intimately with plants for thousands of years, nudging them, favoring them, tending them, long before anyone would have called it farming. And into that long, blurry threshold steps the fig. Because the fig isn't like wheat. It's not a grass you sow, harvest, and replant every year. A fig tree, once rooted, keeps giving, fruiting and fruiting again, sometimes twice a season. And it can be propagated from a cutting, a branch taken from one tree and rooted to grow another, genetically identical to its parent. No seeds required. A tree you can copy from a cutting. Remember that, because it's the key to the whole mystery. So what did the archaeologists actually find in that burned house? The 11,000-year-old mystery. The site has a name, Gilgal I. It sits in the lower Jordan Valley, about 8 miles north of ancient Jericho, a place that would itself become one of the oldest towns on Earth. Gilgal was a small, early Neolithic village, a cluster of round mud brick houses on the valley floor, lived in for roughly 2 centuries, and then abandoned around 11,200 years ago. It was first excavated in 1979 and later studied by a team, including the archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef, with Mordechai Kislev and Anat Hartman. In the remains of one building that had burned down long ago, they found the figs, 9 carbonized fruits, and hundreds of tiny fragments, blackened by the same fire that, by charring them, accidentally preserved them across 11,000 years. Stored, set aside, kept. The dating placed them at roughly 11,400 to 11,200 years old. An old fig, on its own, is not a revolution. People had eaten wild figs for ages. What set these apart was one strange botanical fact, a phenomenon called parthenocarpy. Most fruit only ripens after pollination. That's the whole arrangement. The plant makes something sweet in order to spread its seeds. But a parthenocarpic fig ripens with no pollination at all. It grows soft and sweet and perfectly edible, and it carries no living seeds inside. On its own, a completely seedless tree has a serious problem. It can't reliably produce a next generation, and the figs at Gilgal appear to have been exactly this type. So how did a whole store of them end up dried and saved in a village 11,000 years ago? One interpretation is remarkably simple and remarkably provocative. Someone had to have been keeping these trees alive on purpose. Because a seedless fig struggles to spread itself, the surest way to get more would be for a human to take a cutting and root it. To notice one lucky, sweet mutant tree, to understand that snapping off a branch and pushing it into wet earth would give you another one exactly like it, and then to do it deliberately because the fruit was worth keeping. If that reading holds, the people of Gilgal weren't just gathering wild fruit. They were tending an orchard of clones, 1,000 years before anyone domesticated wheat or barley. As one of the researchers put it, in that single act of planting a chosen fig tree, you can see the beginnings of farming. The first farmer may not have been standing in a golden field of wheat at all. They may have been kneeling beside a tree. But that is an interpretation, not a settled fact. Did humans farm before agriculture? Not everyone was convinced. When the findings were published, other scientists pushed back, and their objection was a good one. A parthenocarpic fig tree doesn't only make seedless fruit. The same tree can still produce a few fruits with living seeds, which means it isn't necessarily a dead end, and it might be able to spread on its own after all. So seedless figs in an ancient village prove people were eating them. They don't prove people were planting them. And that caution makes the story stronger, not weaker. Because the real question underneath all of this is stranger than figs. How do you tell, across 11,000 years, whether a human being was farming at all? It's genuinely hard. Early farming leaves almost no trace, no plow, no fence, no barn. A person who roots a cutting and walks away has just performed an act of agriculture and left behind nothing an archaeologist could ever find. So the honest picture is this: agriculture was never a single invention with a date. It was slow and overlapping. People gathered plants, then protected the good ones. They weeded around them, pruned them, moved shoots from place to place, kept the best and let the rest go. They stored food, and in storing it, scattered seeds around their homes and planted the next crop without meaning to. Every one of those small acts sits somewhere between wild and domesticated, with no clean line between. The version we learned in school is a tidy staircase: wheat, then farming, then villages, then cities, then civilization. But the archaeology keeps refusing to be tidy. It keeps hinting that trees and fruits and 1,000 small experiments were tangled up in the beginning of farming, long before anyone planted a proper field of grain. The fig doesn't overturn that story. It complicates it, in a way that feels much closer to how humans actually behave. We're tinkerers. We notice what's good. We can't leave things alone. And maybe the first thing our ancestors couldn't leave alone was a sweet, seedless fruit hanging from a tree they'd learned to copy. The fruit that fed the ancient world. Whatever happened at Gilgal, one thing is beyond dispute. Once human societies took hold of the fig, they never let go. And to see why, imagine living with no refrigeration and no guarantee that next month there would be enough to eat. For that person, a fresh fig was a fleeting pleasure. It bruised, it spoiled, it was gone in days. But dry it in the sun, and it became something far more valuable: stored food. Laid out on flat rooftops under a Mediterranean sun, figs shrank into dark, chewy, sugar-rich parcels that could keep for months, through the winter, through the long gap between one harvest and the next. That single change, from perishable treat to preserved calorie, turned the fig from a snack into a lifeline. And a preserved food is a food that can travel. Dried figs could be pressed into cakes, strung on cords, bundled into baskets, sealed in jars, and loaded onto boats. A food that survives a journey can be traded, and a food that can be traded becomes wealth. Ancient soldiers carried dried figs on the march. Athletes ate them for energy. Whole households leaned on jars of them to get through the hungry months. On top of that, an established fig tree is generous, throwing off heavy crops year after year for very little in return. So the fig stopped being something you happened to find on a branch. It became part of the infrastructure of survival, a reliable, storable, tradable calorie source a settled community could lean on. Alongside grain, the olive, dates, and grapes, it was one of the quiet supports beneath the first agricultural societies. And nowhere does that come through more vividly than along the shores of the Mediterranean, where the fig would find civilizations ready to worship it, tax it, and carry it to war. Figs, pharaohs, and a fig that helped sell a war start along the Nile. In ancient Egypt, figs were painted onto tomb walls and left in baskets beside the dead, provisions for the journey into the afterlife. They were one valuable thread in a sophisticated food system that also ran on grain, dates, and grapes. A civilization that had mastered growing, storing, and managing food on a scale the world had never seen. Then crossed to Greece, where the fig became something close to a national treasure. Greek writers praised it, Greek athletes trained on it, and the fig was considered so precious that, according to a story told for centuries, the city of Athens passed laws forbidding the finest figs from being carried out of the region. The crop was too valuable to let slip beyond its borders. There's even a theory, debated but wonderfully fitting, that our word sycophant traces back to the Greek for one who shows the fig. Perhaps an informer who reported those illegally smuggling the precious fruit. Whether or not the etymology is true, the fact that people believed it tells you how seriously the Greeks took their figs. But it was Rome that gave the fig its most extraordinary moment. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome had already fought 2 long and bloody wars against a single rival across the sea. Carthage, the great trading power of North Africa. Rome had won both. Carthage had been humbled, stripped of its fleet, forced to pay for its defeats. By every measure, the threat was over. And yet the city would not stay broken. Its harbors filled with ships again, its farmland turned green and rich, its markets swelled with grain and wealth. One Roman senator could not stop thinking about it. Cato the Elder had traveled to Carthage on official business and come home shaken, not by any army, but by how fast the old enemy was growing prosperous again. From that day on, the ancient writers tell us, he ended nearly every speech he gave, whatever the subject, whatever the debate, with the same 6 words: Carthage must be destroyed. But words, he knew, could go stale, so one day he brought a prop. Standing before the assembled Senate, Cato reached into the folds of his toga and let a single fresh fig tumble out into his open hand. He held it up so every senator could see it, plump, ripe, unspoiled, glistening. This fruit, he told them, had grown in the soil of Carthage, and it had been fresh on the tree only days before. Everyone in that chamber understood exactly what that meant. They knew how quickly a fresh fig rots, how fast it softens, wrinkles, and turns. A fig still ripe and perfect could not have traveled far, so a fig this fresh, grown in enemy soil, was proof of something no map could argue with. The enemy was not a distant memory across the world. Carthage was barely 3 days' sail away, close enough to feed you, close enough to reach you. The fig was the argument. We should be careful here. This is a famous anecdote, preserved by ancient writers, and we can't be certain every detail happened exactly this way. It was Cato's relentless political campaign, not a single piece of fruit, that finally pushed Rome to war. But that the story was told at all reveals something remarkable. The fig was so familiar, so precisely understood by every person in that room, that a politician could hold one up as hard evidence and expect an entire Senate to grasp his meaning in an instant. And beyond the drama, the fig had quietly become a serious commodity. The naturalist Pliny the Elder would later catalogue dozens of distinct varieties, describing their flavors and their origins. Dried figs traveled Roman roads and sea lanes, cheap, portable energy that fed the people who built and moved an empire. A wild mutant fruit from the Jordan Valley had become an everyday commodity across the largest empire the West had ever known. The sacred fruit of 3 traditions. There are fruits people eat, and there are fruits people revere. The fig is one of the very few that cross that line. In the Hebrew Bible, the fig tree appears again and again, almost always meaning something good. To sit under your own vine and fig tree became a picture of peace and security, a life settled, safe, provided for. It's an image of a people no longer at war or on the move, but rooted, fed, and at rest. And the fig leaf plays its part in one of the most famous scenes in all of Scripture, in Genesis, where the first humans reach for fig leaves to cover themselves. Of all the plants that could have been named, it was the fig that was closest to hand. In the Christian New Testament, the fig tree returns as an image of fruitfulness and its absence. A tree judged by what it does or doesn't produce, its branches read as a sign of the changing seasons. And in Islam, the fig holds a place of striking honor. One chapter of the Quran, Surah At-Tin, opens with a solemn oath invoking the fig and the olive together, 2 of the ancient Mediterranean's most vital trees, named at the very start of a sacred text. Each tradition gives the fig its own distinct meaning. We shouldn't flatten them into one. But the pattern is hard to miss. Across 3 great faiths, born in the same sun-baked corner of the world, the same fruit keeps surfacing at moments of deep meaning. And the likeliest reason isn't mystical at all. At least part of that sacred power may have grown from something very ordinary. Figs meant food, abundance, and a settled life. The sacred meaning grew, in part, straight out of the everyday one. But there's another partnership hidden inside the fig, far older than any human religion, and far stranger. To find it, you have to go inside the fruit itself. The tiny wasp inside the fig. Here's a fact that sounds like an urban legend, but is simply true. For some kinds of fig, there is a tiny wasp that lives and dies inside the fruit. And for those figs, it's the difference between a flower ripening into a fig and never getting there at all. Start with what a fig actually is, because it isn't a fruit the way an apple is. A fig is, in effect, an entire garden of flowers turned outside in. Hundreds of minuscule blooms lining the inside of a soft, closed pouch. What you bite into isn't flesh around a core of seeds. It's the flowers themselves, and everything that happened to them. All the flowering happens inside, sealed off from the world. Which poses an obvious problem. If the flowers are locked in a closed pod, how does pollen ever get in? The answer is one of the most remarkable partnerships in nature, and it is astonishingly old. Tens of millions of years, far older than the fig's relationship with humans. At the base of the fig is an opening so narrow it has its own name, the ostiole. A female wasp, smaller than a grain of rice and carrying pollen from the fig she was born in, forces her way through this channel into the sealed chamber. The passage is so tight she often tears off her own wings and antennae getting in. There is no going back. Inside, in the dark, she pollinates the flowers, lays her eggs, and dies there in the heart of the fig. Her young hatch, mate, And the next generation of females gathers fresh pollen, crawls out, and flies off to find another fig, beginning the whole cycle again. But don't flatten every fig into this one dramatic story. The prized Smyrna-type figs genuinely need the wasp. Yet the common figs, the kind most of us eat, are those parthenocarpic varieties from earlier. They ripen with no wasp and no pollination at all. In a great many supermarket figs, no wasp was ever involved. And in the ones that were, the fruit itself digests the tiny insect entirely, so there is nothing left to find. Still, the real heart of the fig is this ancient pact, a tree and an insect, so tightly bound that neither can be fully understood without the other, a partnership so precise it blurs the line between plant and animal. And it's a strange preview of what humans would later do to the fig, reach so deep into how a plant reproduces that the two become inseparable. Except we managed it in a few thousand years. How humans changed the fig. Humans didn't just eat figs, they reshaped them. People found the tree with the best fruit, took cuttings from that one tree, and steered the fig toward what they wanted, sweeter, softer, larger. Over thousands of years, thousands of varieties emerged, each one a record of somebody's choice. And because a fig travels as a cutting, it was never bound to the valley where it began. It could go wherever people carried it. They took it a very long way, from the ancient world to the modern table. The fig's journey out into the world is really a story about what the fig became at each step. In the Roman Empire, it spread across the provinces, from North Africa to the edges of Europe. Cheap, dried energy that traveled wherever Rome did. In the medieval Islamic world, it was a trade good, carried along the routes that also moved knowledge, spices, and silk. And when Europeans crossed the Atlantic, the fig became a colonial crop, reaching the Americas by the 16th century, and in 1769, planted by Spanish Franciscan missionaries at Mission San Diego, then carried up the California coast mission by mission. Which is why, to this day, one of America's classic varieties is simply called the mission fig. But California nearly couldn't grow the fig it wanted most, and the reason reaches all the way back to the wasp. In the 19th century, California's growers looked across the world at Turkey and saw a fortune waiting. The Smyrna fig, those rich, golden, honey-sweet dried figs shipped out of the Turkish port of the same name, was the finest dried fig on earth, and it commanded the highest prices. So the growers did the obvious thing. They imported cuttings, planted them in the warm California soil, and waited to get rich. The trees thrived. They grew tall and healthy and green. Each season they flowered, covering themselves in the promise of a harvest. And then, every single year, the disaster repeated. The young figs would form, begin to swell, and then shrivel, yellow, and drop to the ground, unripened and worthless. Not once, not by accident. Every tree, every season, for years on end. The growers tried everything. They changed the soil, the water, the pruning. They accused suppliers of selling them fakes. Nothing worked. A perfect tree in a perfect climate simply refused to make fruit, and no one could say why. The missing ingredient was alive, and it was an ocean away. The Smyrna fig, unlike the common varieties, cannot ripen without pollination. And its only pollinator is that same tiny fig wasp, which had never existed anywhere in North America. The magnificent Turkish trees were standing in California sunshine, flowering season after season, waiting for a partner that had never crossed the sea. So the growers did something almost unbelievable. To grow the fruit, they had to import the insect, shipping the tiny wasp and the special caprifigs it breeds inside, all the way from the Mediterranean, and coaxing it to establish itself in California orchards. It took years of failure before it finally worked. But once the wasps took hold, the trees at last did what they were meant to do, and the fruit ripened. The rescued crop earned a new name that stitched its two homes together, the Calimyrna California plus Smyrna. Think about what that means. Humans had spent 11,000 years carrying the fig around the planet. And now, to complete the journey, They were carrying the insect the fig had secretly depended on all along, and so a fruit that once meant survival for a single Neolithic village became a global crop, grown today by the hundreds of thousands of tons, led by Turkey, whose sun-baked Aegean orchards still supply much of the world's dried figs. The same fruit that carried a family through a Stone Age winter now arrives glossy and out of season, in tidy packets and jams and pastries, sold into a world of refrigeration, supermarkets, and year-round abundance. Same fruit, same species. The same trick of drying sweet flesh in the sun, carried across the entire span of human history, without ever really changing what it is. The fruit that may have predated civilization. So, one last time, why does this fruit matter? Because it doesn't fit the story we usually tell about where we came from. That story is a tidy staircase. First agriculture, then villages, then cities, then civilization. One clean step after another, with a definite beginning and a straight line forward. The fig doesn't fit. It suggests the truth was slower and messier and more human. It hints at a moment, out in the Jordan Valley, in the ashes of a burned house, when people were already reaching into the living world and bending it toward their needs, before the agricultural revolution had fully arrived. Not planting fields, not building granaries, just kneeling by a tree, choosing the sweetest one, and rooting a cutting because they'd noticed something worth keeping. We can't say for certain the figs of Gilgal were farmed. Honest scientists still argue about it, and they're right to. But even the argument is a gift, because it forces us to admit that the beginning of civilization was never a single bright line. It was a long, dim threshold, crossed one small experiment at a time, by people whose names we will never know. And somewhere in that warm valley, a fig tree may have been part of it. One of the very first living things our species ever chose, shaped and carried forward on purpose. Before cities had walls. Before kings had crowns. Before history had learned to write itself down. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more, and tell us which moment caught you most off guard. Because the fig wasn't just a fruit that survived civilization. It may have been there before civilization began.